All right, so today I am going to talk about Standoff at Sundown by Jim Woods. And I got my checklist here, starting with the introduction. And I've got a folder here of notes. Yay, to keep me kind of organized here so I don't yammer on and on forever, hopefully. Okay, so Standoff at Sundown is written, of course, by Jim Woods. This is not his debut novel, and actually, I think it's a little under 200 pages. I'm not sure what the age range is for this, the recommended one. To me, this seems kind of like, well, I'd say it's adult because there's some violence, a little bit of gore. Um, so I would say it's probably adult. It's probably a safe age. A publication date? Actually, that's a really good question. I'm really sorry, y'all. I forgot to take notes here and find out. Maybe I can just find out on the internet real quick. Um, well, I'll put in the description of when it was published. Sorry, Jim. Okay, so anyway, that's the introduction. So let's see. Next is the setting. Now, as you can tell from the cover, this is a Western, and as such, you can expect it to take place in like the late 1800s. Generally, a Western is going to take place before 1900 and after, say, the Civil War, usually around like the 1870s. I'm not sure if a specific date was mentioned, but the one of the protagonists is a Civil War veteran, so it's safe to say it's after the antebellum period, as they used to say. Now, the town that the story is set in is Red Rock, Colorado, and as near as I can tell, that's a fictitious town. It doesn't actually exist. There is like a Red Rock Formation, if I'm not mistaken, in Colorado. I don't know if that's where Jim got the idea for the name or not. I can tell you that I'm from Round Rock, Texas, and so every time I read Red Rock, I was like, did they spell Round Rock wrong? It's a different thing. It's a unique setting. It's like the setting of the story takes place in you've got like the deserts of Colorado. So I guess it's probably like if you've been to Colorado, like the southern end does have some desert areas to it. Although I think Fort Collins is kind of up there a bit, and it's kind of deserty too. It's terrain I guess is kind of weird. Climates are strange. There's of course a small town. There's a homestead, and at one point in time they're in a forest. I made a note here that there's no rivers because like sometimes you read a Western and they got like a river they got to cross or a river that they're following because water is pretty hard to come by. But I don't think there's any rivers. There might be a creek at some point, but which I guess is kind of serving a similar purpose. But anyway, setting is kind of like a standard Western, small town. And let's see the characters. So the main character is a guy named McCall. He's the protagonist. And if you read the back cover here, you can kind of tell that like basically the premise of the story is that he becomes a reluctant deputy or de facto sheriff of a small town. So he's the main guy. The first chapter does begin from the POV of the town's current sheriff, who I believe is named Cobb. Let me see. Let me check my notes here. I have Cobb written down, but I forget if he's the sheriff. I forgot to note that. But I'm like 99% sure that's the sheriff. So the first chapter, in some ways, is almost like a prologue. I guess this is kind of like under plot here, but we're still under characters because we're talking about Cobb. But I'll just leave that there. Sorry, I'm going out of order a little bit here. Now, there's also a young man named Jonah who becomes a deputy. He was a pretty cool guy. There's a character named Emma who was McCall's daughter. And most westerns you got like the lone gunman type person, but McCall is actually a widower with a teenage daughter. Kind of interesting and kind of different, that he's not Clint Eastwood. We can certainly say that. There's also a character named Anna who's kind of a potential love interest. There's kind of a subplot. I don't recall. I don't think it goes too far. It's a subplot, but I would not call this a romance novel. That's for sure. It's a western, and I'm okay with that. There's also a character named Wyatt who runs the general store. He also becomes a deputy. He's got an interesting way of talking. I'll say that. Now there's a villain named Grady who really comes across as a psycho, and I guess I'll leave that at that because, well, I mean, the villain is well, you'll find out if you read. There's also a banker named Hicks, which I wondered if that was an Aliens reference, because one of the things on the back here is Jim says that he's a fan of the X-Files, and I wonder if he's seen Aliens, where like one of the characters is named Hicks. Rest in peace, Bill Paxton. I'm really not sure though. That's something only Jim would really know. In terms of the characters in a general sense, I like the dialogue in this book. It's very Western. It's I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it. In my Substack article, I wrote down that like in the West, it's generally the case that you have very laconic people, and yet there's sort of a very straightforward eloquence to them when they do talk. And I don't really know a better way to describe it than that. Gosh, maybe I should probably have a better way of describing it since I am a writer, but I don't. So I'm just going to leave it at that and say that the dialogue to me, like it seemed like it would fit into something like, a Western TV show or a film, something like that. It was pretty good. Now, for the plot, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Bad guys come to town. Usually, I think in the Substack article, one of the things I mentioned was that, like, usually with these westerns, you have something. It's either the lone gunman comes to town, or bad guys come to the town, or both. If you look at, or not look at, but you watch a film like Shane, it's actually a combination of both. Where, if I recall correctly, Shane comes to town. He's like a solitary former gunslinger who doesn't want any trouble. And there's some bad guys, and then I think Shane is the one where you've got Jack Palance being like the real bad guy. Um, and So it's actually like a combination of the two. But generally, it's one or the other. In this case, McCall is a homesteader, I suppose you could say. I wasn't sure if he had a farm or if he was a rancher. I know in the Old West that there was a substantial difference between the two. Sometimes it was like you had the politics of the ranchers and the farmers wanting different things because they need water for different areas, different amounts and such. But I guess that's a whole other thing. Now the gunfights in this book were pretty good. I like them because there's a bit of a build up to it. In fact, I forgot to write it down here in my notes, but one of the things I do remember is, let's see, let me make sure I don't have this under spoilers because I don't want to spoil anything before I get to the spoiler section. But I guess it's enough to say that there is a particular gunfight where they sort of break into a room, you could say, and there's a group of men, and they're in a standoff, and it's very tense. And of all things, it actually reminded me of something that's not a Western, which is if you've seen The Sopranos, there's a episode of that show where a group of guys they rob a card game, and they just bust into this room where there's all this money on the table, and they're holding these guys at gunpoint, and it's just like so tense. And one of the I guess, well, this is kind of a spoiler because I'm going to tell you it results in a gunfight, but you have a standoff moment there where it's very tense, and it reminded me of Sopranos, even though The Sopranos isn't a Western. Um, but in any case, I thought that the gunfights, there were multiple ones. They were done pretty well. There's a conspiracy in the plot in terms of a guy named Dawson who well, again, this not trying to spoil anything. I don't think he makes an appearance in this novel. It seems like it's a setup for the next one. But there's a conspiracy involving the crimes that are taking place, and it's not really resolved. I assume it's going to take place in the sequel, like I just said, and it was okay. It was mentioned enough that you have some sort of a build-up. There's like kind of a conspiracy and such. I really like noir type stories though, so I'm down for conspiracy. And plus, again, like the thing is, the guy's an X-Files fan, so of course there's got to be a conspiracy, and I'm all in favor of that. One of the things I really liked about the plot was that the main character doesn't try to wage like a one-man war. He goes around and he tries to find people to help him. I suppose in some ways that's really kind of a mix of the characters and the plot, but I did like the idea that someone knows when they need help. And Clint Eastwood's been in a bunch of westerns. He was in gosh, what was it? I think it was Magnum Force, like the second Dirty Harry movie, and he has that funny quote at the end where all the bad guys are dead at the end of that movie. And he's just like, a man's got to know his limitations. And throughout that book, I was thinking of that because whenever I read a western, I'm thinking of Dirty Harry, or not Dirty Harry, I'm sorry, Clint Eastwood. Because he's been in so many westerns, I just can't help myself, I suppose, but thinking about him and the films he's been in and such. And McCall is definitely someone who knows his limitations and is not afraid to ask for help. And that's something that's sort of a departure from, I think, some of the tropes that you find. I did like that particular detail. So for themes, I have two things listed here, and actually the first one is that McCall asks for, knows that he needs help from other people. So I guess I kind of put that in my notes twice. Whoops, sorry about that. And the other theme is the idea of, do you choose to face evil? At what point is it worth it? At what point is it not worth it? And can you confront evil without becoming evil yourself? So fighting evil in others and yourself at the same time. Pretty well done. For a 200-page book, I thought it was pretty good. And let's see, inside the author studio. So just based upon what I found on Jim Wood's Goodreads and Amazon profile, he's a writer living in Ohio, which, by the way, Jim, I lived in Ohio for like, oh, gosh, almost 10 years, and I don't know how anyone, heck, I don't know how I survived up there with those winters. And I'm very happy to be back in Texas. That's all I can say. Nothing against Ohio, just being up north. I just don't like living places where you can accidentally leave a window open and die. Because it's just so cold up there. Gosh, I remember there was one day, I think when the wind chill was -40. But, well, anyway, I'm sorry. I don't mean to go off on a tangent. But in any case, Jim is from Ohio. He likes the X-Files. He's written some other books. You can find him on his author profile on Amazon. And I guess that's really all I got for Jim. I guess the other thing to mention is that Jim is working on a sequel to this book. I think actually it just released this week because I saw him make a post on Substack about it. So if you read this book, if I know some people, or I guess not some people, some readers, they would like to read a book that has the potential to lead to a series or for there to be a sequel. So if you're interested in Westerns, this could become, well, can't speak for Jim, but maybe this will turn into a longer series. There's at least 2 books right now. So let's see, critique. Well, one thing I did want to point out, and I hope that the author doesn't mind me showing, I'll just show like the first page here. This critique section is actually a good thing I want to point out, which is that the book is really, really well formatted. Like it's, I'm trying to find a page where I didn't scribble some chicken scratch in the margins because I love to write chicken scratch in the margins, and by that I mean my thoughts. Well, actually, I write on all my pages here. I have like things highlighted and such. And well, here, I'll just show you the beginning. Anyway, it's a well-formatted book. I didn't notice a lot of grammatical mistakes or spelling errors. It's well put together. Now, I know that that's a pretty good quote to start. I did have something else I want to note here. I guess it's really more of the spoiler section, which is, I guess I'll just move on to that. Well, before I do, I write science fiction, and one thing I noticed when I was getting beta readers and such was that a lot of times people, when they like your genre, they're actually more critical of your book. Actually, I shouldn't necessarily say that. By comparison, when I got beta readers for my science fiction novel, there were folks who didn't like the genre, but they liked to read, and they were really just excited with the idea, seemingly, of reading a new author's work. And I got pretty good, consistent feedback from those folks. The people who seemed really excited were science fiction fans, and their reaction, their critique of my book was actually more, I want to say, there was more variance. There was more, I guess, what would you call it, deviation? Oh, maybe that's not the right word, because you got standard deviation. Really more like there was a larger variance in that people seemed to either really like it or really not like it if they like sci-fi. And when I looked at that feedback, I think it's because some of them they understood the tropes better. That also led them to not wanting to have the tropes or their feedbacks, or not feedback, expectations subverted, I guess you could say. They brought preconceived notions because they had read so much in the genre. I've read some Westerns. I'm more familiar with really film and television. But to me, I can't help but comparing anything that's a Western with every other Western. And so it's difficult for me to be objective. And I guess that's really just what I wanted to say in terms of critiquing, because I know that when I'm the writer and I'm in a situation where people are like, well, how come you didn't do this? I'm like, well, because I wrote my own book. I wrote the book for me. Jim wrote the book that he wanted to. And so there were a couple things that I'll get into in the spoiler section where, to me, they didn't necessarily add up. But it's not really a criticism. I have to be real about it. And it's kind of poetic in a way because as a writer, I'm now seeing it from the other side of, gosh, the tropes weren't used the way that I thought they would be, but it's kind of like probably what he was trying to do. And I should be okay with that, Anyway, I'm not trying to spill tea or anything. I'm just trying to be real about how I'm kind of partial about my westerns. I'm kind of picky. It's like with Star Wars fans. Sometimes they're really critical of Star Wars because I know a lot of Star Wars fans. They criticize it, but then there's like, I'm like, why are you so critical of it? And they're like, because we love it. It's like, it's just one of those things about being a fan of a genre or something like that, I guess. Anyway, I actually didn't put anything in my notes here about conclusions. I was just gonna say, if you like westerns or if you like short reads, check it out. You know, and I mean, honestly, Jim, to me, it's real simple. You keep writing westerns, I'm gonna keep reading them. So that's my opinion. All right, so spoilers, spoilers, spoilers. Okay, so I did have a few things here. I did have I like the fact that the guy was a Civil War veteran. I almost wondered if there was going to be a twist that like maybe he actually fought for like the Confederate side or something, and he was like upset with himself, and because one of the big character arc is of course the idea of do you want to participate in something that could be violent, being the town sheriff, and at what point is it justified to use force. I wondered if his background, like if it turned out that he actually fought for the losing side of the war and maybe came to like let's say not really gosh, what is the word I'm looking for here, um if he, I don't want to say disgraced, but I mean the South was the losing side, certainly not militarily only, but also like morally. There's like a moral question of force, and would his character background be more interesting if he fought for the side that he came to realize was morally wrong? And that's something that I thought would be pretty cool. Anyway, that's just a random idea. Uh, Jonah, when he dies, I thought that was pretty good. And again, sorry, but we're in spoiler territory here. Uh, but that just like the suddenness of it, that seemed to be really realistic, and how devastating it was. I really liked one aspect of the ending here, which was that Jim this whole time is kind of struggling. Is it Jim McCall? Actually, I'm real sorry. I should probably know this, but let me check. Well, I'm not going to check in. I wrote down in my notes McCall, and that's what I kept. I think that's really what he goes by. But McCall's daughter doesn't recognize him at the end. And the whole time, McCall's been worried that he's going to turn into like a immoral, evil person. And so having her at the very last page not recognize him at first, I was like, dude, that's really, really good. Like 10 out of 10. I really like that detail. And something I mentioned in the Substack article was that there's a final image that kind of matches, I mean, spoilery, of course, but kind of matches what you see on the cover here with like the sunset and everything. I thought that was a really good touch. I like that a lot. There was one thing that didn't 100% add up to me, which was there's the banker named Hicks. His well, how should I say this? For some reason, I had this thought when I was reading the book about, of all things, Jaws. Which, if you've seen that movie, um, there is a scene in it in which the sheriff of the small town, Amityville, I think it is, meets with the mayor, and the dynamic there is that the sheriff, who's played by Roy Schneider, wants to shut down the town because Jaws the shark is attacking. You're probably wondering, what on earth does that have to do with a western? I mean, it's a shark in the ocean. It's Jaws. That has nothing to do with it. Don't worry, I'm going to get to that. But the mayor tells him Amityville is a summer town and needs summer dollars. Great piece of dialogue. Great scene. Usually what happens in a western is you have something that's not exactly the opposite, but take for example 310 to Yuma. You have this scene where there's actually not a mayor of the town, but there's actually a representative from the railroad, and he wants, I think it's Russell Crowe's character. 310 to Yuma, I mean the 2007 one. I know that there's an older one, but I have seen the 2007 one with Russell Crowe. It's one of those movies where Russell Crowe gets angry and then lots of people die. I guess most of his movies are like that, to be real. But in any case, this representative from the railroad wants to tell Christian Bale, like, or his character rather, can I'll pay you, and so to take Russell Crowe to the prison yard, or I'm sorry, the train that's going to take him to prison rather. And so it's generally in a western you have the idea of a civilian counterpart to the protagonist that I don't want to say temptations, temptate. It's not even a word. That tries to kind of like steer the protagonist into doing the right thing. Tempt him usually with money of like, hey, I'll pay you to do this.
even if it happens to be the right thing. I thought that the banker was really going to fill in for that because in the first chapter, he's the guy who warns the sheriff about trouble headed to town. And I thought that if the town was too small for a mayor, that maybe the banker was going to fill in for that and really give McCall like a motive of some kind and say like, hey, you got to get on this. Really, because if anything, the banker has such a vested interest in law and order being in the town. If you're a banker in a little western town in the wild, wild west and the sheriff is shot and there's no replacement, I mean, one of the things I noted here was that that banker should have been freaking out. And maybe it's because I grew up in kind of a poor neighborhood in the South. In fact, I have kind of a funny story. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but when I was a little kid, I was at the local bank, and this guy came in, looked a little. I knew that there was something off about the guy. Let's just say that he, slick back hair, leather jacket, and had this like smirk on his face, and just the way he carried himself was so like, I don't know. I remember I was a little kid at the time, but I noticed that there was something off about that dude. And he comes in and he starts looking around, scoping the place out. And this big security guard came out of the back of the bank, like one of the back rooms, and just like squared up. And this guy, this thug-looking guy, kind of smirked a bit, goes up to the teller, gives her a dollar bill, and says, "Can I have 4 quarters?" And I mean, you could have heard a pin drop. And she gives him 4 quarters. He kind of like looks around the place with this little smirk, and he walks out. And everyone just like you could hear everyone exhaling at the same time. And I really wonder if I almost witnessed a bank robbery when I was like, I don't know, a little kid or something. But anyway, sorry to go off on that tangent, y'all. But in any case, I thought that the banker should be freaking out and he would be like really motivated to get McCall to be the sheriff, or he'd be telegramming, or is it telegraph? He'd be on the wire trying to get some Pinkertons or something out there because I can't imagine that that bank wouldn't have been robbed in 5 minutes. Now that we're in the spoiler section, I mean the reason I wanted to cover this in spoilers is because there is that conspiracy with Dawson, and I really wondered if maybe the banker was in on it in some way, and or maybe the bank didn't get robbed because Dawson told the hired guns, "Don't rob the bank because my money's in there. You're going to be robbing Peter to pay Paul." So that's one thing that I'm kind of wondering if the next book is going to cover. Like, what is the banker? Why did he not get robbed? Because if he's not in on the conspiracy but happens to be benefiting, like he's Dawson's telling his guys not to rob it, it still would make sense to me that he would be freaking out. Then again, on the other hand, what I have to say on the other side of this is that by not having the banker apply that kind of motivation or trying to present that option to McCall, it does make for the protagonist, or I guess I'll rephrase that. McCall as a protagonist is stronger in that he reaches this conclusion on his own, that he has to bring law and order to the town. And so in a way, it does make the story somewhat stronger. I can't help but overanalyze a Western. Like I said earlier about the whole, super over critiquingness of people who are fans of the genre. I have to overthink. And because, I mean, in Jim's defense, I read so much noir, like detective style stories and such, where there's always a conspiracy about something. I can't turn off that part of my mind. It keeps going. It's like its own little hamster wheel. Sorry about that. Uh, let's see. I don't think I really had much else noted here. I did note that I don't think the canteens were mentioned too much, which I think in a Western, water is a big deal, but that's kind of a minor nitpicky. I'm splitting hairs here, to be real with y'all. I write down everything I think in my notes here. I guess that's why it's only a page. Well, I guess that's all I had. So, just to recap everything, this is the book. It's got a really good cover. If you read my Substack article, you noted it reminded me of Monument Valley. If you've never been out there, Monument Valley is a really nice place, and by that I mean it's really scenic. Like if you've ever seen a Western, like Monument Valley because they filmed so much out there. John Ford did anyway. I think back in the 30s or 40s or 50s. I should probably know the answer to which decade, but anyway, it's a pretty good book. I think if you like westerns or if you want a short read for the summertime, this is worth checking out for sure.
And that's really all I have for today. So I suppose that's all, y'all. Hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you next time. So long.